You've seen the title here, I think, is well, the title I intended is a circular saw, a Gauloise, and a little red wine, and that was actually something which Lord Snowdon described. That's how he described the idea of the most felicitous afternoon he could imagine, you know, making things and feeling relaxed. And that was. But can I have the first slide, or do I have to press? This? It's the first and only slide, I think. Yeah, it's all working. I'm sorry, it's so difficult to follow the future of sex. Stonehenge is there not just to emphasize the primitive force of my arguments, but to make the point, which I've always felt absolutely impassioned about, that civilizations aren't remembered by their public sector borrowing requirement or any other abstract financial notion. Civilizations are remembered by the stuff they leave behind. You know, like most people's obsessions, mine were formed in childhood. I was never actually taken to football matches or fishing or whatever it is meant to constitute, healthy growing up. But I was dragged around the factories which my father managed. I can remember now, Saturday afternoons with the smell of hot oil and swarf underneath your feet, and that introduced me to the romance of machines, which is something still with me now. I mean, my father was the sort of engineer type who was absolutely obsessively interested in how things were made. He could actually be a frightful bore about it. He loved to hold up, drink tins of beer or tins of Coke or something and say, "Do you know how this was made?" And seriously, I don't know if you know how a drinks tin is made, but it's made with a tiny little pellet of aluminium put into a die and hit with immense force. And it's an extraordinarily clever thing. And anyway, I was brought up thinking things like this. And I was thinking about it, and I got to the stage of wanting to give a talk like this time last year. I mean, I've always been, as you perhaps know, interested, passionate indeed, about design. But my passion about design is coming together now with this idea, this theology, this John Ruskin revival I want to introduce to you today, about the importance of making things. It doesn't matter how many brilliant industrial designers you've got if you haven't got any industry for them to work in. And I started thinking this. I was actually on exactly this time last year. I was on a Vaporetto in Venice, one of the little steamers, and I started testing myself on that thing which my father had said to me about. Did I know how this was made? And I was just looking at the Vaporetto, and I just kept on thinking, the deck, how's the deck made? Has that been cast or forged or stamped? And how was the superstructure made? And I realized I didn't know, and I become so ashamed by not knowing, even though I fancy myself as having some sort of expert insights into the nature of design, that I've decided, this campaign now, we've got to understand more about making things, and I'll tell you the reasons why. I've actually even developed a fantasy conversation with the Prime Minister, which goes something like this. I said, Dave, do you actually know what a rivet is? I'm serious. What I mean is, here's David Cameron, somebody who's admirable in many, many ways, super smart guy, the beneficiary of an elite education. I bet you he could not describe the way a rivet works. And I think that's struck me as absolutely deplorable, because if you know how a simple thing like a rivet actually works, you understand all sorts of valuable stuff. You understand the theory of mechanics, you understand the history of structures, material technologies, stress, load paths, and all the aesthetic limitations of working in metal. Understanding a rivet, is an education in itself. I got another fantasy as well. My fantasies are much more wholesome than the last speakers. My fantasies are about chairs. I would love to take Dave, or indeed any member of the cabinet, or indeed the opposition front bench, and ask them, Mr. Miliband, could you tell me how that chair was made? I bet you there's no answer to it. I'm appalled that our economy was once based on what's been called creative destruction. I mean, the Industrial Revolution was about acts of destruction, because creativity is always destructive. But lately, that's been turned around. Instead of destructive creative destruction, we've had destructive creation, and that's what's going on at St. Paul's and in the park in New York. Instead of making proper things like chairs. Our economy's been obsessed with making things of absolutely no cultural value, and as it turns out, no economic value either. We said, witness what's going on at St. Paul's. All that smouldering anger we can see in the demonstrators in New York and London and elsewhere. It's actually, I think, it's really rooted in this business about the decline of manufacturing. Because without making things, we live in a culture which has lost its meaning. Probably many of you remember this time last year, Neil McGregor, the boss of the British Museum, did a fabulous radio series on Radio 4 called The History of the World in 100 Great Objects. Fabulous, fabulous stuff. And one thing you're never going to hear is a program called A History of the World in 100 Great Credit Default Swaps. I do believe this. What do I mean by meaningless culture? I did a little experiment before I came here. I go everywhere, usually carrying a brown leather bag, which happens to be made in Brazil. And I empty the contents of the bag onto the table, and this is a short catalogue. There was my fountain pen, which is German, rollerball pen made by Mitsubishi in Japan, a camera made by Nikon in Japan, my glasses by Alan Mickley, France, sunglasses Ray-Ban in America. My notebook was an Italian moleskin. My multi-tool was a Leatherman made in the United States. My car keys were for a Mercedes-Benz made in Stuttgart. My laptop was in there. It's a Mac. My phone was made in Canada. And all of this, in the culture of Josiah Wedgwood. Wedgwood was, we heard a lot about Steve Jobs recently, but, Wedgwood was Steve Jobs, avant le mot. He was the prototype. Josiah Wedgwood, it wasn't just someone who could make great ceramic products. He actually knew about image as well. He wrote sales catalogs. He also knew how a pyrometer worked. He saw it as a totality. From 2 centuries on, the idea of, I think, Wedgwood mocks us in our miserable economy. One of the great questions in all of history is how and why did the civilization, which invented industrial production, why did we so easily give it up? I think it'd be too crude to blame the bankers, although, of course, blaming bankers is always great fun. But I think what we can probably do is apportion a certain amount of blame to the bankers' pilot fish, the economists. In successive governments of each different persuasion, economists, for one reason or other, have argued against manufacturing, and I think that's been absolutely ruinous. There's been a systematic bias in all classic economic theory. If anybody, probably got some economists amongst you, but you will know in Keynes's general theory, there are all sorts of theories and accounts of how you raise productivity and increase wealth, but desire, yearning, material things seem to play no part in Keynes or indeed in any other classical economist's imagination. This is because the classical economist proposition is that price alone dominates human incentives. Now, quite rightly, the idea that price is the most important thing is everywhere under attack, and that's because it's entirely wrong. That's why Stonehenge is here. No one knows what Stonehenge cost, and no one cares. No one matters. People don't worry about the cost of the great adventures of the human spirit. There isn't a profit and loss account for the Great Western Railway, but we're very glad it happens. Solid products, things that are made, are surely amongst the most important things in our civilization. And I love the fact that Alec Isagonis, the Mini, probably the most influential car of all time, certainly one of the most ingenious. And I know what I'm saying is deplorable if you're a classical economist. British Motor Corporation, it was introduced in 1959. It was only in 1976 that BMC realized they were making each car at a loss. But I'm serious. But it sort of doesn't matter now, does it? Because we have this wonderful intellectual thing. Another anecdote about cars. André Citroën, of course, whose business went bankrupt and had to be bought by Michelin. But never mind that. André Citroën, he made some of the greatest cars ever. Citroën said, from the moment an idea is worth having, no one cares what it costs. And even better than that is something the filmmaker Billy Wilder once said. And it was this. He said, I'll tell you one thing you never, ever, ever hear. It's this. You've got to go and see this such and such a movie. I hear it came in under budget. I want to say cost doesn't matter. But anyway, as I said, just as classical economics is being revised by economists, we've now got this thing called behavioral economics, nudge economics, it actually appears that the economists may just soon be beginning to realize, what makers have always known, and it's this, that desire is not numerical. I detest McKinsey. The McKinsey view of the world, I can't think anything more deplorable. Mr. McKinsey, who founded this dreadful business, said you can measure anything, and if you can measure it, you can manage it. Now, the thing is, you can only measure very simple, crude things. You actually can't measure all the important things in the world, like beauty, peace, love and happiness. I think that, the world, or at least my world, is I want, and your world too, I hope, and our future world, we're going to move beyond the cold calculus, of metrics. When I talk about that, we're going to return to the joy, the pleasure, the engagement with making things. What I'm not trying to advocate, though, I'm not trying to advocate some sort of sentimental return to dirty old industry, with ruddy-faced artisans in leather aprons working in sordid conditions in rural Surrey. Instead, what I mean is, what my campaign is, I just want people to better appreciate the sort of universal benefits of actually making things. If you can make something, if you know how to make that chair, for instance, you have to acquire very superior mechanical skills, but you also have superior cognitive skills as well. The design of a stacking chair, such as this, it was made by an American guy called David Rowland. The design of a successful stacking chair is actually really at the outer limits of human ability. Teach that, and you're teaching something really, really valuable. The riveter, back to my obsession with rivets. If you rivet things, and I recommend you buy a rivet gun at the earliest possibility, you immediately intuit from first principles. Hand-eye, the hand-eye, function, and you actually begin to understand at a practical level that old thing about form and function. And anyway, making things, that's just a personal thing. It's personally rewarding to know how to, and it's an educational thing if you understand the nature of making. And I earnestly recommend as a test as you go about your everyday lives, ask yourself. I always do it myself now, just asking myself, do I understand, how it's made? But it's also got a larger sort of macro element, of course. Because in a country like ours, where we're all dragging around sort of 5 times our own weight in mood-altering deficit, there are all sorts of other advantages too to making things. You can understand ideas, materials, markets. If you make money, if you only make money, all you need is, as Lord Chesterfield said of somebody, you only need the morals of a whore and the manners of a dancing master. And when you make things, importantly, you restore that really supremely important moral connection between effort and reward, which of course has been completely lost in the flim-flam of post-industrial sophistry. This is all actually beautifully explained in a sadly little-known book by a California engineer called Julian King, who in 1944 wrote something called the Unwritten Laws of Engineering. Now, what King explains here is that engineering isn't actually about mechanics, physics. Engineering, making things. Engineering is actually about behavior. If you live in a culture which a small unit or a larger culture which manufactures things, you have to the manufacturing demands that individuals have to be decisive and that they share in information, and this sort of positively aids human development. You have to, if you're making something, you have to start with an idea, and then you have to become it evolves into a more elaborate specification, but it is in turn mass-produced, distributed, consumed, recycled. At each stage of the manufacturing process, additional skills and extra value are required and generated. And then there is the question, too, back to the contents of my bag, of national identity. Do we actually really want to live in a real culture, or a ghost culture? Do we want to be an offshore shopping mall populated by 60 million owners of orphan-stitched Mulberry handbags? Or would we actually prefer to be surrounded by, well-considered and well-made, meaningful products and buildings? Are traditions just going to be quaint memories, or should we be busy making the traditions of the future? My point is really that you don't get riots and looting in workshops. But there are actually some reasons. This is not a counsel of despair. I'm actually quite stimulated by what's going on. There are some reasons for hope. Tomorrow afternoon, unless Ferrari gets terribly lucky, a British car will win the Brazilian Grand Prix. Even if it's called a Mercedes. The Mercedes racing cars are actually designed and made in this country, in Brackley and Northamptonshire. It's quite astonishing that at this late stage in our industrial decline, we somehow or other have managed to keep alive the advanced skills which are required to make successful Grand Prix cars. Last week, happily, Dave, while he skipped my lesson on rivets, but he went to see McLaren McLaren in Woking, where he saw at first hand the extraordinary expertise that exists there. There is a form of British manufacturing that still exists that humbles all competitors. I mean, the Americans, the French, the Japanese, the Italians, and the Germans have all tried to do well in Formula One in the past 50 years, and no one has actually done it as well as this. And I'm often asked, if you're so clever, what would you do to change our attitudes to manufacturing? And it was Dave's visit to McLaren which made me think this. What have you got to do? You realise that Formula One, for instance, it's a mixture of technology, craft, design, a bit of snake oil, research and development, materials science, specialised manufacturing, aerodynamics, communications, multi-channel access, marketing, branding, teamwork, management, graphics, art, logistics, supply chain management, administration, sex, speed and desire. In fact, Formula One has got all the things which are really necessary for a successful modern economy. I like to think in my fantasy, if I have my riveting fantasy, my chair fantasy, I also like to think that Dave might think Formula One should not so much be on the national curriculum, it should actually perhaps become, the national curriculum. I'm serious. I mean, why not? I mean, who wrote the rule that education has to be boring and dull? My point, anyway, about making things is this. Scientific invention and artistic creativity are not in themselves enough. I mean, creativity, the old economists, Gordon Brown was always telling us we live in the creative Britain. Creativity can't exist autonomously. It has to feed off, off manufacturing. The connection to workshops, keeps ideas alive. You have to be able to make things in order to conceptualize them in the first place. I've got two supporters here. One is the president of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Susan Hockfield, who recently said our American economy will only thrive when we make what we invent. And she's absolutely right, of course. And second is my old pal, John Ruskin. Well, I used to think John Ruskin was a preposterous old Tory bigot, and perhaps I'm just getting old, but I'm coming to accommodate myself to him. Ruskin said many wonderful things. The things I like is this: men don't and can't live by exchanging articles, but by producing them. We don't live by trade, but by work. Now, if your work involves making things, you intuit the relationship between effort and reward. The banking system lost all connection between effort and reward. That's why it's wrong and why I'm right. We want to live in future in a workshop, not a casino, and perhaps spend our afternoons with a circular saw, a Gauloise, and a little red wine. Thank you.
For more big thinking about the future, go to iq2if.com.